Finland stands at #1 yet again in the World Happiness Report that ranked a total of 147 countries for its 2025 edition. So where does South Korea stand? We tell you on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome. It's Friday, March 21st, and you're watching Press Perspective. The world marked International Day of Happiness yesterday. That was March 20th. And in line with this occasion, the latest findings of the World Happiness Report were released. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with American International News Agency, UPI, here in the studio. Thomas, as always, it's great to have you back.
Great to be here. Thank you.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with the pundit's take on today's topic. Colin, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Right, Colin, I believe we'll start with you today. What exactly is the World Happiness Report, and what do you suppose is the significance of such publications?
The World Happiness Report comes out once a year. It's the product of this organization that is it combines parts of Oxford University and the Gallup, the polling association, the polling agency, and the UN. So parts of those three organizations work together to produce this report, and it's heavily based on Gallup polling. Essentially, the polls are finding out what people around the world, how they feel about their own life. Like, what's your life satisfaction? Do you feel, how much positive emotions? How many negative emotions do you feel? And it's quantitative measuring, but it's all subjective, of course. These are self-reported feelings, essentially, about how life is going. So they're trying to find these aggregate measures of how happy each country is, how satisfied the people of each country are with their lives. And so then out comes this ranking, of course. That's what gets attention. The ranking, what we're going to be talking about today, this grand list of which countries are the happiest, or relatively happy, or relatively unhappy. And Finland has been #1 for some years now. And I have an interest in Finnish culture. I've studied the Finnish language a bit. I don't know if we would call Finns happy by American or even Korean standards. I think each culture kind of has its own definition of happiness, which might be a problem with this methodology. You should take it with a grain of salt just for the reason that definitions of happiness don't really track culture to culture, not perfectly. I note that of the top 10 countries, the top 10 happiest countries, according to the World Happiness Report, 8 of them, I believe, are in Northern or Northwestern Europe. And I'm not saying that Finland and Switzerland, for example, have similar cultures, but they're more similar than perhaps they are to, one of them would be to Korea or to the United States. So bear that in mind, that regions tend to have their own cultural definitions of happiness. And I mean, this has been coming out since 2011, which was really the peak of happiness research being an interest, a subject of discussion in the West. Can we quantify happiness? Can we measure it? What can we do to boost it? And it was I remember a big thing, Bhutan, the small kingdom of Bhutan between China and India, got a lot of press because they rolled out this gross national happiness metric, which is, it's not GNP, not GDP, gross national or domestic product. We're looking more holistically. We're finding gross national happiness, which it got them a sort of 50 minutes of fame, but I wonder, and I think a lot of people I knew wondered if this is maybe just more of a way for a monarchical regime to keep itself in power. I mean, you can fudge these numbers, whereas GNP, GDP are a little more checkable and they're more obvious. Are you reporting correctly or not? But I think this gets a lot of attention, and certainly in a society like South Korea, where people are regarded as unhappy, even by Koreans themselves, you can understand why it gets attention.
Right, and before we talk about Korea's ranking, Thomas, what factors are considered in the ranking of a country's happiness with regard to this particular report, the World Happiness Report?
Well, actually, it's really, they do try to correct for a bit or account for a bit of what Colin was pointing out about the subjective nature of happiness. I mean, of course, it still is a self-reported answer, but the main question, and really what the ranking is based on initially, is a single self-evaluation question that's not so much are you happy, but it's a ladder of 10 or I guess 11 rungs, 0 at the bottom, 10 at the top, and 0 being the worst possible outcome for your life, 10 being the best possible outcome for your life, and then asking where do you see yourself on that ladder. And so they're sort of saying that is more of a way of not basing it on, the emotion of that day. Are you particularly happy? Is something happening to you emotionally? But more like, where do you see yourself in life? And that's really what they base the ranking on, the aggregate, responses to that. But then with that, they do have all these other data points and some other survey questions. And those are in 6 main variables, which include having someone to count on, economic measures, GDP per capita, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make life choices, generosity, and freedom from corruption. So these various personal, interpersonal, and then social and economic factors. And then they kind of try to correlate between those factors and the way people respond to try to get a kind of a broader picture of what drives happiness, or what causes people to report feeling satisfied with life. And they also, it seems, yearly maybe focus on different segments within that. And this year they seem to be focusing on kind of this element of caring and sharing in people's personal lives and interpersonally. And there were some survey questions about how much and how often do people give money to charities? Do they volunteer? Do they help strangers? And then also how much they expect sort of the benevolence of others in their society. How much do you expect would you expect somebody to return your wallet if you lost it? Those sorts of questions. And they do find a high correlation, especially I think within the expected benevolence with how much you report self-happiness. So, and there's other factors like living alone, loneliness, they talked about a rise in that. So they also try to track different trends going over the years. But that's the basic structure of this report.
Right. All this being said, then, Colin, where does South Korea rank, and what are your takeaways?
Well, drum roll, it's 58 out of 147, I believe, or around 150 countries. Bhutan not included, interestingly, anymore. I'm not sure why that is, but there you have it. So 58, it's not great, but to many Korea watchers, to people who follow news of Korean society here on Arirang or elsewhere, it sounds actually all right compared to the stories you constantly hear about Koreans being fed up with the nature of modern Korean existence, whether it be professional or social or academic, or the suicide rate as well. Something that Finland, the #1 for many years in a row, has done much to fix in their own way. They used to have a very high suicide rate. That's come down over the past 35 years. But yes, Korea is known as an unhappy country. Daniel Tudor, the former Economist correspondent, wrote a famous book called Korea the Impossible Country in English. Here it was translated as 기적 이룬 나라 기쁨 잃은 나라. So the country that achieved a miracle and lost its happiness. And that's the Korean title. That's the standard accepted narrative here. Oh, we're not happy. We're not happy anymore. Maybe we were before, but we're not now for various reasons. So it's actually okay when you consider, oh, these are Koreans reporting their happiness level. And it's not at the bottom. It's above many countries, below many countries as well. The US is like 23 now, but people are kind of wringing their hands about that because it used to be in the top 20, and now Americans aren't happy anymore. What's going on? So there is some soul searching being done in certain countries that have lost rank, and Korea, I believe, has fallen a bit as well. But on the whole, I think this is not the worst sign you could hear about Koreans' view of life. And part of it, I think, has to do with what I would call a culture of dissatisfaction in Korea. In that, I'll illustrate this by saying I was in Osaka years ago talking to a bar owner there. And many Koreans visit Osaka. You go there, you hear Korean on the street because many live there, but many also, there are a lot of Korean tourists. And he was saying, this bar owner, I run this bar in a guest house above the bar, and Koreans come all the time. And as soon as he heard I lived in Korea, he was like, tell me, how can I get Koreans to give me 5 stars on their reviews? I can never get 5 stars. It's always, the most is 4. That last star, they never give it. And I think that's very telling. You're not going to get full points from many Koreans. For whatever reason, culturally or due to other factors, people don't want to they always want a little more. And that can be a good thing. I think a lot of the dissatisfaction with Korea results in things we like about life in Korea or life in Seoul. If people hadn't been, I use this phrase in Korean media, 불평의 힘, the power of complaints. And I think because of that dissatisfaction, things have been improved. But the dissatisfaction itself is unlikely to fully go away, not anytime soon.
Right. Thomas, the words of wisdom are that money cannot buy happiness. But here in Korea, money plays a very big role, appears to play a very big role with regard to happiness. Do you suppose this is a more or less universal phenomenon, or is this just evident here in the country, do you think?
Well, I think to some degree it's universal. There are gradations of how important it is. I mean, I would say, generally speaking, Korea does have a pretty strong consumerist, materialist, sense of what to strive for in life. I think, I read, was it last year or the year before, that Korea is still the largest consumers of luxury goods in the world, per capita. And there's consumerism. There's a kind of a status consciousness, I think, that also goes along. It's not just dollars or won. It's also, I think, a sense of an awareness of status that applies to where you live, where you go to school, there's a very fierce competition within that world. So, I mean, Korea, it's not unique to Korea, but there are some levels, I think, where it has an extreme expression here. There's always this question of how much does money correlate or cause happiness? I know there's been some famous studies in the past. There was one about 10 years ago that maybe the number's gone up, but it was something like once you reach $75,000 annual income, your happiness rises to that point and then it plateaus after that. And then there's been some other variations on that theme. And I think, you can look at billionaires today in the world and they don't necessarily seem like the happiest people. So I think, there's a level at which we realize that money is not, the answer to all your problems. And I think within Korea, I mean, obviously the material growth of the country has engendered a lot of well-being in people's lives, but I think some of this level of the status seeking and the competition that it drives has also led to unhappiness. And with one thing that was noted in this World Happiness Report was that things they categorize as deaths of despair, deaths by drug overdose and suicides have gone down really mostly across the boards, but have gone up in the US is one where drug overdoses, and South Korea is one of the only other countries where this deaths of despair factor has gone up, and this is driven by high suicide rates. And I mean, we know that there's those kinds of social pressures that apply to Korea. So there are those elements. I mean, there are countervailing elements to that, like some of the things I mentioned earlier about some of the other factors are things like sharing meals, a culture of eating together, cultures, and a sort of a sense of social trust, which I think is fairly high in Korea. So, we can see countervailing elements, but I would say that is an issue. Maybe the kind of nouveau riche, fast economic growth era is not so much here in Korea anymore, but I mean, there is still a deep, I think, level of status and kind of ranking yourself in society that is quite strong here. And I think that does, it does, as Colin mentioned too, does lead people to sort of strive for things. I mean, that is an inexorable part of, I think, what has driven Korea's success, but I think it also does lead to angst, suffering, and then sometimes despair.
Right.
One thing I might note before the next question is that what came to mind when Thomas was speaking, that Alain de Botton, the famous Swiss writer here, famous in Korea especially, he writes a lot of books related to culture and self-help, and he had one called Status Anxiety, or Status Anxiety in English, which when translated into Korean was simply translated as buran, anxiety, as if you don't even have to say status. We know it's about status. That's anxiety. It's all about status.
Right. You really make me think. There's some food for thought right there. Right, Colin, let's move on now to other stories that made international headlines. A South Korean county recently received quite a bit of international spotlight for its efforts to fight its shrinking population, Colin, by opening its doors wider to refugees from Myanmar. Could you tell us a bit more about this? Yes,
this is Yongyang-gun in Gyeongsang, North Gyeongsang province. And to give you an idea of how remote this place is, it would be hard to overstate. It's the closest city is Daegu, and it's 2 hours drive from Daegu. So this is not a metropolitan center by any means, by any stretch of the imagination. It is the geographical defined area with the lowest population in Korea, apart from Ulleungdo at the island. So yeah, they're not doing so well demographically. I think the population is down to about 15,000 right now. So they're participating. They've announced this program to bring in refugees who are part of the Karen ethnic group in Myanmar, and they've they're not having a good time over there, to put it mildly. They're a separatist minority, you could say, and they're fighting this military junta in power, been in power the last few years in Myanmar. And they try to escape to Thailand, but the Thai government does not want them there either. So they tend to take in refugees for a moment and say, you know, when the gunshots stop happening, when we stop hearing explosions on that side of the border, get back over there. And so coming to Korea does not seem like a bad option if you are a member of the Karen minority, I assume. So in Yongyang-gun, the idea is they'll take in families of 4 or more, up to 10 of those families. And so they're going to take 40 people, essentially, which is not going to make a big dent either in the number of refugees from the Karen people, or it's not going to boost the population very much either in Yongyang-gun. So this is a pilot program, you could say, a proof of concept. So try it, see how it goes. There's some talk of repurposing closed schools, of which we hear very much in Korean news, to accommodate them maybe as housing, maybe as some other kind of facilities. They say that of the possible refugee populations to take in, the Karen are more likely to assimilate or more assimilable than many others. We'll see about it. I wonder how concrete the results of this will be, but it's in any case worth trying. For some of these regions, there's nowhere to go but down, alas. So, you know, if they think they can make this work, more power to them, I say. But if Yongyang-gun can do it, anybody can. Any area of this country can do it. So in a way, it's a good place to start.
Right. And all this being said, Thomas, Germany, it once served as a model for opening doors to refugees, as I believe did Canada. What's the latest on that front? And based on what our Colin has just said, do you suppose opening doors to refugees could serve as a practical option for Korea to fight its population decline?
Right. Well, in Germany, as in many, many places around the world, in this past year or so, the refugee issue, immigration in general, were just extremely hot button issues. I mean, they were economic and social factors as well as they were just extremely volatile political factors. I mean, certainly that was the case in the US and certainly in Germany, which, you know, as you mentioned, really it was in 2015 under Angela Merkel, Germany decided to take this very leading role in Europe and sort of do an open door policy almost with accepting asylum seekers, and accepted, you know, around 1 million, you know, especially from places like Iraq, Syria, in 2015 to 2016. And at first there was an extremely positive response to it. People were going to train stations to welcome them. You know, there was, you know, offers to house people, but the mood kind of soured fairly quickly. There were some high-profile crimes. There was a stabbing in the New Year's Eve in Cologne, or a few attacks by some migrants from North Africa. And I think, you know, it's been a push and pull. And in some cases, you know, advocates have pointed out that a lot of most of Germany's population growth in this period of around 10 years is driven entirely by immigration, by legal immigration, or, you know, by sort of non-refugee and refugee immigration, and much of its economic growth and employment growth in particular is also driven by that. So there are these net positive outcomes, but at the same time, there have been strains on social safety net issues, and you know, and especially maybe in like more regional areas, you know, large numbers have upset or challenged the balance of you know, just what people consider everyday life. So it's become an incredibly, you know, complex issue. And then with just the general state of economic downturn, it's been, you know, more and more of a hot button. They're taking our resources and that sort of thing. And, you know, we saw the outcome in the results in Germany, where the far right AfD party won 20% of the vote. The center right won around 29%, but the leader of that party has already said they're going to fundamentally reform the you know, migration policies. And Canada, to a lesser extent, but similarly made a big reversal. They had also really promoted this open door policy, and Justin Trudeau, who just stepped down as prime minister, really, you know, contrasted with Trump the first time around, and, you know, offered Canada as a welcoming destination. But just within the last, you know, several months, they've started advertising like it's not so easy to get asylum in Canada. They felt that it's also created some issues, and I think there's been public pushback against it. So it's, you know, it remains a very complex issue. I mean, there are a lot of advocates that point to the net positive from not just immigration in general, but from refugee acceptance. And when Colin mentioned the Karen group, I mean, there's some cases in the U.S. where cities that were just in these very declining areas and declining populations have rebounded by becoming very open to become like cities of immigrants. And there's one, Utica, New York, which has, I think it's like 10,000 Karen out of 60,000 in the population. A place like Dayton, Ohio. So there are some cities that have really completely turned to this, and specifically, to refugee acceptance. And so, to come back to Korea, I mean, Korea has one of the lowest asylum seeker acceptance rates of any countries in the OECD. It's something like 2% over, I think there's only been a few thousand accepted over the past 30 years in total. And I think we've seen there's been a resistance to it in the past. I remember when I was first here, there was the Yemeni seekers that came to Jeju, and there was a big pushback against that. But as part of a solution, for example, this one town we're talking about, I feel like it has to be kind of an option on the table, and it could be, if managed well, it certainly could be an opportunity, I think. And I would hope South Korea would certainly, at least explore it more fully.
Right. Colin, based on findings for last year, out of every 100 residents here in South Korea, 5 are now foreigners. What have been your observations?
It's a number that raises your eyebrow a bit. I could have sworn last I heard this, Korea was only 2%. Foreign residents, and now it's 5%. Okay, maybe, because when you're in Central Seoul, it doesn't feel that way. You think, well, I could have sworn everybody I saw today, of the thousands of people on the street, were all Korean. But then, of course, about half of the 2.65 million foreigners now, not quite half, maybe 1 million are Chinese. And you see this when you go to the immigration office. You go to one floor if you're Chinese, the other floor if you're non-Chinese. That's how they divide it. That tells you how many there are here. But the vast majority, I believe, are from Asia. And so you have that. You have the fact that many live in remote parts of Korea, not in Central Seoul, working in factories, doing agricultural work, or the famous archetype of the Vietnamese bride of the son who runs the farm now somewhere in Jeollado. There are those. Those are real. That's a real phenomenon. But I do suspect as well that much has been done to increase this number. Depending on the methodology that Statistics Korea use, they can get a different number. You can kind of get the number you want. And so they've included everybody who could possibly be included in this count. Students who are here temporarily, the students who are going to go back, Koreans, ethnic Koreans of foreign nationality, they're included. They've pushed this as far as it goes. Why? Well, our good friends, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, have a threshold beyond which a country is considered a multicultural, multiracial country. It happens to be 5%, which just so happens to be where Korea is right now at that count. The 2.65 million is 5%. So above that, you are a multicultural society. And you can catch this in the wind. I mean, the idea that being the Danil Minjok, the one race society, is not a good look anymore somehow. So, what official Korea, as I like to call it, I think they're thinking about what can we do to change our image in that sense. And this is one step toward it, to be officially declared multicultural, even though anyone who comes here does not perceive it as a multicultural country. Least of all the immigrants who come from other Asian countries, I suspect. There's a conflict between experience and official categorization, but when it comes to the OECD and their categories, Korea always wants to get in the right place, shall we say.
Right. Well, hopefully immigration, for the time being, hopefully immigration can serve to tackle Korea's declining population.
Indeed.
Then quite a number of pundits here are hoping so. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Colin, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
And Thomas, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, well, that does it for us this week. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend.